The phenomenon of consciousness is no doubt extraordinary. To be aware of and responsive to our surroundings is arguably the most mysterious and important aspect of our lives. But is it so extraordinary, so special, that it must be the product of divine intellect? This is the argument from Consciousness Debunked. Likewise to most theological arguments, there are many types of arguments from consciousness, each differing in the premises they use and the way they're conveyed. But in this video we're going to focus on the most popular type, that being arguments from consciousness that assert that neither naturalism or materialism can provide an adequate explanation of consciousness, but that theism can. So, to present this argument in its syllogistic form, it is a fact that human consciousness exists. This fact can be adequately explained within a theistic framework, i.e. one which posits God's existence, whereas it cannot be adequately explained within a naturalistic or materialistic framework, i.e. one which lacks a belief in God's existence. Hence, there is a fact that only theism can adequately explain. Therefore, God exists. To take on this argument, it's critical that we first define what consciousness means, and preferably within 10 hours. But jokes aside, its basic definition is the state of being aware of and responsive to one's surroundings, which is indeed what most of us mean when we say consciousness. But the reason this needs to be nailed down immediately is because many proponents of the argument from consciousness attempt to implicitly define it to mean something that it's not, such as a transcendent part of the human personality, and in doing this they're attempting to smuggle immaterial and unnatural properties into the definition of consciousness, which is essentially a backhand way of begging the question. Hence, however one defines consciousness, they must first acknowledge that every shred of evidence has so far supported the statement that consciousness is a product of the mind, which in turn is a product of the brain. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest that our consciousness is independent of our bodies. None. With that said, let's get on with it. Let's debunk the argument from consciousness. In my opinion, the first objection to be stated is that premise 3 doesn't follow from premise 2, making the entire argument a non-sequitur. Even if we were to assume that theism can adequately explain consciousness, and that naturalism can't, it by no means follows from this alone that only theism can explain consciousness. To name a few alternatives, deism and pantheism can both explain consciousness within their frameworks, and so right from the outset the argument from consciousness isn't coherent. Its conclusion doesn't follow from its premises even if they were all valid, which so far as arguments go is pretty damn pathetic. But while we're on the topic of alternative worldviews that can explain consciousness, the fact that the argument from consciousness posits only naturalism and theism as valid options, without justifying why these two options are the only available, means that it commits a black and white fallacy. Furthermore, and by extension, this also means that the argument hasn't fulfilled its burden of proof. It hasn't substantiated the claim that only naturalism and theism are valid options. A third flaw to raise is that even if the conclusion of the argument was valid, all it would prove is that theism alone can explain consciousness. It wouldn't even suggest, let alone prove, that a specific religion is true. And as Christopher Hitchens once said, even if you've established deism, you've still got all of your work ahead of you to be a theist. Hence, even if it was valid, the argument from consciousness doesn't remotely support a specific theistic religion. A fourth spectacular flaw that the argument from consciousness commits is a giant argument from ignorance. If we cut to the core of what's being asserted, it's essentially that because we can't explain consciousness from a naturalistic framework, which by the way we can, theism must be correct. Or put more directly, the argument from consciousness is founded on the statement that we don't know how to explain consciousness, therefore God. A fifth flaw, and to get back to the erroneous assertion that naturalism can't explain consciousness, is that it can. It's called natural selection. At the risk of boring you through repetition, Natural selection is the process whereby organisms that are better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. To state it very, very simply, the nervous system evolved to orchestrate movement. Feelings evolved to move organisms towards or away from stimulus. Awareness evolved to make sense of these feelings, and consciousness evolved to allow organisms to respond more efficiently to their feelings. And finally, a fifth flaw that many of the proponents of the argument from consciousness commit is a personal incredulity fallacy. While I implied earlier that all of the proponents of this argument commit an argument from ignorance fallacy, that's not always true. Some proponents will appeal to ignorance and will indeed commit an argument from ignorance, but others won't appeal to ignorance and will instead simply dismiss evolution by natural selection because they can't personally understand it, and hence they'd be committing a personal incredulity fallacy. So, to recap, the argument from consciousness is flawed because it's a non-sequitur, it commits a black and white fallacy, it doesn't support a specific religion, it completely ignores evolution by natural selection, and, depending on the delivery of the proponent, it commits an argument from ignorance or a personal incredulity fallacy. Before I leave you with an overwhelmingly powerful argument to consider, I'd like to quickly say thank you. Over the last 4 days, this channel has went from about 404 subscribers to over 1,100. The evidence suggests that Hemant Mehta, being the absolute legend that he is, created a post about one of my videos, which brought a butt ton of views to my channel from an external source, which in turn triggered YouTube's algorithm to put that video on their trending section, which by the way was awesome. But despite this evidence, what I really think happened is that Zeus wanted me to find new subscribers, and so he inspired, in his mysterious and undetectable way, Hemant to share my content. Praise be to Zeus, for he is almighty. Jokes aside, thank you Hemant, that was very kind of you, and I won't forget it. And a massive thank you to everyone else who has shared my content and has subscribed to me. You're all absolute legends. And finally, thank you YouTube for making the algorithm give small channels a chance. That really shows that you care about creators over money, which in this day and age is truly something. Anyhow, as for that overwhelmingly powerful argument to consider, it goes as follows. It is a fact that YouTube subscriptions exist. This fact can be adequately explained within a loving framework, i.e., one where subscribers love the channels they subscribe to, whereas it cannot be adequately explained within a hating framework, i.e., one where subscribers hate the channels they subscribe to. Hence, there is a fact that only a loving framework can adequately explain. Therefore, Eros, the god of love, exists.